Lord Byron famously said that there were two things true of him: that he had a love of liberty and a detestation of cant. Meaning, of course, that he celebrated freedom, openness, motion, flexibility, plasticity, all virtues that you see on full display in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and in Don Juan. Kant, of course, suggests hypocrisy, deceit, pomposity. And we see in both these poems, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and Don Juan, Byron using irony over and over again to deflate various kinds of cant, hypocrisy, pomposity. And he uses irony to deflate in the service of freedom. The idea being that people are unable to explore the fullness of their possibilities if they fit themselves too deliberately into a kind of social role that they play, that they reduce themselves to. So Byron's very aware of the fact that all of us wear masks all the time. Because we certainly can't reveal our entire self to anyone. Well, we can, but we generally don't to get along in society. So in these two poems, he's constantly mocking forms, stilted forms, conventional forms, static forms, the kind of forms that civilization has used, still uses, to make sense, provide order, provide system. But of course, if one is overly subscribed into order and system, one hinders one's own ability to be free, explore possibility. So ultimately, Byron will conclude that it's impossible not to have a mask. Indeed, Childe Harold, the character, is something of a mask for Lord Byron, the person. The key for Byron, it seems, is to be able to move among different masks as the situation dictates, to be playful, protean. The problem comes when you choose, say, just one mask. Byron was notoriously mercurial, heterogeneous, varied. This caused problems. He sometimes was not a loyal friend. He certainly was not a loyal husband, but also that was part of the attraction of his person. In any case, I want to talk a little bit about how Byron uses irony in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Canto 1, to deflate forms that he would have found overly stilted. For instance, he calls the poem a pilgrimage, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Of course, child in this case does not mean child as a young person. Child is an ancient form, essentially meaning sir, a knight. So Childe Harold is going on a pilgrimage. Well, what's a pilgrimage? Generally, a pilgrimage is a journey with a definite end, a linear journey or a quest that one undertakes to find a treasure or a holy relic. And the pilgrimage is often associated with austerity. One must undergo sacrifice, danger, discomfort to reach the end. But the subtitle of the work is a romaunt, which is a word that means romance, in particular the medieval romance. During the European Middle Ages, there were a number of narratives, prose narratives, about a fantastical, marvelous world, a world of dragons and spirits and monsters and elves and all the lore one might associate with medieval mythology. And the romance essentially would feature a knight errant, a knight not associated with any lord or king or kingdom, just a knight errant out looking for adventure. And that would ultimately be the shape of the plot. Shapeless. The knight errant goes over to this forest. Oh, fights a dragon over here. The knight errant goes over to that mountainscape. Oh, there's a castle. Oh, there's a maiden in the castle the knight might want to save. Oh, let's go over here. Oh, there's a witch, so on and so forth. So Byron is setting at odds already the poem. It's against itself. How can the poem be both a pilgrimage and a roman. The two are diametrically opposed to each other, one suggesting orderly quest, the other suggesting haphazard adventure. Well, this distinction is further complicated by the fact that the poem is neither. It is not a pilgrimage. It just features Childe Harold sort of wandering whimsically over Europe without any quest in mind. He's simply escaping from a guilt-ridden negative past. So there's yet a third irony that neither of these traditional terms, pilgrimage or roman, describes the poem, which again, it's set in modern times, a character moving through modern history, meaning the history of the late 1800s and early 18 teens. So it's not a romance, it's not a pilgrimage. So that's just an initial example of how Byron is sort of deflating the whole idea that one should go on an austral pilgrimage, or one should pay fealty to an old form like the romance. This is a very modern, open adventure, and it could take Childe Harold really anywhere, and it's moving Childe Harold over a modern landscape informed by modern history. And it's the attention to history right here, right now, in that world that suggests the openness and the freedom, the liberty, whereas the older forms might suggest a kind of pomposity or stiltedness. So there's more to this. You probably noticed early on that Byron uses archaic language, like in stanza 2 of this first canto. We see him describing Childe Harold. Wilhelm in Albion's isle there dwelt a youth, who nay in virtue's ways did take delight, but spent his days in riot most uncouth, and vexed with mirth the drowsy ear of night. Ah me, in sooth, he was a shameless wight, sore given to revel and ungodly glee. Few earthly things found favor in his sight, save concubines and carnal company, and flaunting wassailers of high and low degree. So Willem, who na in virtue's ways take delight, who na, N-E, not, who did not take delight. He's called a wight. So in those three instances, we see archaic language, the kind of language you might find in Spenser's The Faerie Queene. The Faerie Queene was an Elizabethan poem devoted to the virtues of knighthood, and each book of that poem was meant to explore a different virtue. And Spenser wrote this long poem in a particular stanza, a stanza that Byron is here using. It's simply known as the Spenserian stanza. You can have a look at it. The whole poem is written basically in this one stanzaic form. It's a very complicated stanza. A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C. All the lines except the last one are iambic pentameter, and the last one is an Alexandrine, which adds another 2 syllables to the 10 beats of the pentameter line. So it's a very complicated and old stanza. So on the one hand, the poem seems to be saying, look, I'm going to write a medieval romance basically in a form that was popular during the early modern period. But then we realize fairly quickly that this is a poem, again, about a person moving in modern Europe, dealing with very recent political events having to do with the Peninsular War, a war basically between England and France, in which Spain is also involved. So there's another tension there, that it's like he's setting up this idea of an old honored form, but he breaks that form. There are other such examples. The poem opens up with what seems to be an invocation of the muse. O thou in Hellas deemed of heavenly birth, muse formed or fabled at the minstrel's will, sent shameful oft by later lyres on earth, mine dares not call thee from thy sacred hill. Yet I've wandered by thy vaunted rill, yes, sighed o'er Delphi's long deserted shrine, where save that feeble fountain all is still, nor mote my shell awake the weary nine, to grace so plain a tale at this lowly lay of mine. So it's both an invocation of the muse and an anti-invocation of the muse. He's basically saying, Okay, I'm gonna invoke you, muse, to inspire my poem, but maybe you're fabled. And you know what? You're probably not that powerful because a lot of poets have not really treated you well over the many centuries. And in fact, I think your fountain is pretty feeble. And therefore, I don't really think you'll bless my tale, my weary tale. So the minute you see a long poem that begins with an invocation of the muse, of course, what do you expect? You expect an epic, something grand, something that tries to speak the virtues of a whole culture. But here Byron's saying, okay, here's the invocation of the muse. Oh no, not really. So yet again, there's a setting up of expectation and an undercutting, an ironic deflation. And there are many other examples. I'll just point to one more. Um, the poem is about Childe Harold, and sometimes it seems that we're seeing the world through Childe Harold's eyes directly, but then other times it's like Childe Harold goes away for very long periods, and we see the world through the narrator's eyes. And the narrator's paying attention to the events of modern history. The narrator is very interested in this world right now. Childe Harold is exhausted and weary and trying to escape, whereas the narrator is doing the opposite. He's energetic and lively and trying to connect. So we see, like, for instance, we see stanza 24, 25, 26, 27, where suddenly we have the narrator paying attention to Sintra and talking about the Convention of Sintra, which is an important moment in the Peninsular War. And he's going into detail about that. And then suddenly in stanza 27, the narrator, it's as if he remembers, oh, wait a minute, I've got a character. So deemed the child, as over mountains he did take his way in solitary guise. In other words, there's a conflict between the mask or the character of Childe Harold and the narrator, who probably is closer in sensibility to Lord Byron himself, who was an avid student of history. So there's another tension in the piece between the traditional hero of the romance and the lively historian who's constantly undercutting, deflating the hero of the romance. So those are just four examples of what I'm calling ironic deflation in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. And this technique, I think, helps Byron fulfill his maxim that he has a love of liberty and a detestation of cant.